And so I've now remembered to record, and as people arrive, we'll just we will go from there. So let us begin with a short prayer. Let us pray. Loving God, this has been a long journey, and yet there is still so much left to explore. When we converse and when we talk about Revelation, there's always the question of what does it mean for us today? Help us to wrestle with that and help us to explore what that means. And so surround us with your love and peace today. Give us a spirit of learning that we might hear what you are saying to us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. And here comes Betty. Okay. So again, today is, of course, our last day as far as Revelation is concerned. Again, I think I've made this comment before. Is Revelation is one of these ones where, I planned this out over 7 sessions intentionally, symbolically and what have you. I could have done it over 12. Frankly, it's also a university course that we could, like go half chapter by half chapter or image by image. But at the same time, that's a lot of work to go through. It's funny as we get started, and just one of the other places where I've been in, I don't think I have the ability to show it on the screen here. But has anybody ever seen there's been kind of floating around something that clergy kind of share sometime around this year, but usually anytime stories involving angels show up, and it's a picture of a biblically accurate angel, and the caption, and I mean, it's got like 6 wings and there's eyes all over the wings. There is no human form to it. It's just this, it's these wings, that are pretty much as described in Ezekiel chapter 10. And as opposed to, human beings with large, sort of dove-like wings out the back, which curiously enough is not actually a biblical image. That is a Renaissance image. Anytime angels show up, they are not really generally depicted as humans with wings, because when the wings show up, they've got eyes and everything all over them. And that is an image that John of Patmos borrows from Ezekiel in Revelation as well. So let's get into it. This is where we have been. So we have come through the several different weeks. And so here, of course, week 5, and then last week we talked about the vision of ultimate hope, and brought you up to the beginning of, to the end of chapter 20. We went chapter 17 through 20, and then this week is the actual title of tonight is Reclaiming Revelation. Because it's one of these things where too many of my colleagues, I think particularly in mainline denominations, have just said, have gone kind of the Martin Luther route. We don't like to see this in the Bible. Whereas I'm very much in it is part of our tradition. How do we work with it? How do we understand it? And so that's part of the part of bringing it in. And so that is reclaiming Revelation, and that's tonight. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do just a bit of a recap from last week. We're going to explore specifically chapters 21 to 22. And then there's kind of more of an open discussion that is really just sort of a back and forth, and some conversation that we can have have around that. So my actual content is shorter than previous weeks. I'm not going to try and blow through it as quickly as I say I've done in other weeks. I want to linger on some of these images, but then also a chance for you to ask questions. There's even a slide where it says, you know, it like stump the minister night. You know, as always, my philosophy when it comes to this sort of thing is that there's no such thing as a stupid question. There's never a bad time to ask it. And thirdly, though, the caveat is the answer, I don't know, is a perfectly legitimate answer. And so, but that's part of it. And so that's that stump the minister is part of tonight. So we can open that up. So just going over last week, what we're dealing with now this week is the 7th part of these 7 visions of the end. And just as a bit of a recap, most of these 7 visions are all very, very, very short. They're like just, you know, 3, 4, 5 verses probably at best. And the one thing to remember is that these are not sequential events, but things that kind of interact with each other. So it's not like this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, because Revelation's the intentionally pictorial language is intentionally the diachronic. In other words, time is like you know, things are not in a logical, necessarily a logical sequence. It's a group of 7. It's just how they happen to be written down, because we kind of have to do that. But they're not necessarily sequential events. And so it's non-objectifying language. And what these do is perform a literary function, not a literal function. Do you understand the difference between that? Literary in terms of how it evokes, how it engages your emotions, how it really, you know, the question is, how do you feel? As opposed to, you know, like trying to kind of think your way through it. It's intended to kind of, you know, be much more emotive. And so these are all also expressions of this big theological word that we call eschatology. And eschatology comes from 2 Greek words, eschaton, meaning the end, and anything usually, or where it says ology, that's actually logos. So logos meaning words. So in other words, words like, so biology is the words about life, bios. So the study of life. The eschaton, which is a concept that we really just don't have good, like English is a very versatile language. We adopt a lot of things. But there are some places where we just do not have good words for stuff. And unfortunately, we have to explain it using other words to try and get there. And even then, it doesn't quite work. And eschaton probably is defined as the end, but not just the end as in the end of the road, but to what end, what purpose, what meaning. It means both. Curiously enough, in English, that is actually something that is a feature that we think of end, like end times, but end times doesn't mean like, you know, story stops there. It's the ultimate purpose of what are the end times, to what end are the time, are we moving to? In other words, what is the meaning and purpose, as opposed to when the road stops. And that's one thing to keep in mind. So what we are looking at here is the expression of ultimate future, not like a sequential time, but ultimately what we're moving towards, that is something as near as our next breath or as far away as 1 billion years from now. It's just that matter of time, because we tend to think chronologically as opposed to kairos, in God's time. And so Revelation only uses the concept of chronos, in other words, sequential time, 4 times. Okay, and we're actually past all of those expressions in Revelation when we get to chapter 21. And more often than not, the greatest use of is actually using the sense of season, the cyclical nature of time. That we say winter, and winter is something that is generally considered to be a season. We start at a week from tomorrow, and but it's a case of when winter is over, it comes back again, and it is sequential. And so we can talk about in the cold and snow of winter, for example, from In the Bulb There Is a Flower. We can talk about winter and not mean like winter in a particular date. It generally means something, and that's what it's intended here. And then most importantly, even though it's not as much, is it happens here, and importantly, see chapter 22 verse 10 is the last time that this of any use of concept of time happens, and it's the kairos of God, the right time, the fullness of time, God's time is how that's expressed. But these are where those happen. So any questions about that before we get back to that? Because for John of Patmos, this is not about something like an end, like an object that we're moving towards, but we're moving towards someone, namely God. So again, this is just a little quick review that we talked about the parousia, or the presence. The last battle, and I put that in quotes because there's not actually, people gather for battle and then a battle doesn't happen, or at least a battle is never described. It's not there. The writers at Marvel would have a terrible time with it. It's kind of like, well, aren't they supposed to fight? Well, there's no fighting written. It's over. And then you have the binding of the dragon / Satan, the millennium, the defeat of Gog and Magog, the last stand. In other words, evil's last kick. Then you have the last judgment, that whole lake of fire thing coming in, including where death and hell are destroyed. And then we move on to what we're dealing with tonight, and that is the New Jerusalem. So let's talk about the New Jerusalem. Now, before we get to this, any questions about what we did last week? Anything else sort of lingering, or do you want to hold on to that until? All right, let's proceed. So so this is chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. What we have here is, in essence, a sense of echoing the completion of creation, but like the perfecting of creation. Because in the original stories of creation, and even in the early part of Revelation, there's a very important thing that one of the pieces, and I've emphasized this before, is because we are descended from a culture that is largely a maritimer or mariner culture. If we have roots in the British Isles, there is a lot, even the most landlocked people were dependent upon the mariners in the sailing industry. The sea was not something to be afraid of; it was something to be embraced and embraced with all of its risks, and tamed in that sense. Hebrew culture was quite the opposite. So like the seas were horrible places filled with all kinds of creatures, and the roiling chaos that just happened to be just the waves, even from shore. If you've ever been out to Peggy's Cove with a great big ocean swell comes in, or out at Pacific Rim, and just watching those ocean swells come in off the Pacific, like emerging out of the mists, that kind of thing, that seething chaos. But what happens is, earlier in Revelation, we have the sea is glass. In other words, that chaos is completely tamed. But at this point, the sea is no more. Now, okay, for us, especially in an era of climate change, looking at the concept of having the sea evaporate is not exact, you know, because so much life is there and so much of our life is dependent upon that. This is not literal. What this means is that the symbol, the sea being the symbol of chaos, is completely, like, there is no more chaos. The chaos is gone, like isn't just tamed, it's gone. And so that's one of the things to remember in this new heaven, you know, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth. In other words, everything is different, and the sea is no more. There is no chaos. It is gone. There, just God's order. And what that is symbolic of is the complete overcoming of evil. And at this point also is that re-invocation of I am the Alpha and the Omega, which also appears, you know, what we're here is we're on the other, like, if you can consider the front of the opening of the book as the one bookend, we're now at the other bookend. And so I am the Alpha, the Omega, and it also re-echoes those blessings to the early churches, to the one who conquer I give, bing, bing, bing. And those images start echoing back through here. So there is actually a genuine literary bookmark on either end, and this is the other end of it. Then we have, now there is this interesting exclusionary passage. And let me just, here we are. I realize it looks like I'm just kind of reaching into the earth and pulling up my Bible, but so some of these ones, this is where, you know, we might find ourselves somewhat challenged, more challenged. But you know, let's go to chapter 21, verse 8. And this is New Revised Standard Version, by the way. But as for the cowardly, the faithful, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. In other words, that lake of fire that we talked about. So there we have this exclusionary passage. You know, and okay, it's important that it's there, and it's important that we see that. But I'm going to get to that in a second. What this is this isn't about condemning those people out there. It is actually about the those effectively moral failures within Christians under the threat of persecution or assimilation into the culture. That's what this is pointing at. Again, everything's symbolic, not literal. And there's another additional nuance to this that we get to in just a moment. So these are the personification of vices. You know, I unfortunately, somewhere around my house, and I can't find it now. There were now, I would imagine, how many of you have happened to have seen Disney's rather interesting retelling of the story of Hercules? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. It's fun. Oh, Richard, you've seen it. Okay, so all right. It is fun. Is it anywhere close to actual Greek mythology? No, but it is fun. And they introduced two characters in there, voiced by Matt Frewer of Max Headroom fame, and Bobcat Goldthwait, who was kind of famous for himself. Like, and you know, they were fairly well known figures when the movie was released. You know, like 26 to 7 years ago. But they played a character, two demons that had the name Pain and Panic. And so what you have with those two little demons in that telling of the story is you have the personification of those particular things. Pain, one, he was painful to listen to, and he constantly hurt himself. And panic was always skittish and looking around. So in essence, what you have here in Revelation is these things are not people, but rather personifications of vices. In other words, the human tendencies that lead to any one of these things. And so the idea was, from John's perspective, these sins were the result of or associated with, if they were participating in what is referred to as the imperial cult. Now, I'd have to do a caveat here. There's a little bit of scholarly language here. Generally, we think of cult as in religious cult, like Scientologists or something like that. And scholars tend to use it, especially when talking about ancient religious traditions, about faith practices, and like certain in sectarian senses. So participating in the rites and rituals of imperial Roman worship is what that means. And again, becoming assimilated into Roman society.
Can you give an example?
Well, for example, the big example that Christians ran into was they would there's sort of two. There's the obvious one and the less obvious one. The obvious one is that someone, this happened more after Revelation was written, but it was starting to become a practice, is that Christians, like Jews, were radical monotheists. There is only one God. You cannot, they do not swear fealty to any other God but God. But of course, Roman emperors in particular, especially in this era, started seeing themselves as divine and incorporating not just worship of, say, Apollo or Jupiter, or Mars, Roma. If you were in Greece, you'd use their Greek names. That often involved, like, burning incense or that kind of thing. But the Roman emperors would often have their own statues there, and especially it was a sign of loyalty. It was effectively the Pledge of Allegiance, that one had to show their allegiance by, in essence, burning incense and saying a prayer to the emperor. And of course, if you were serious about being a Christian, and very many were, doing so violated the first commandment of "You shall have no other gods before me." Okay, so and so to place incense in a little burner in front of the statue of the current emperor was the obvious one. The less obvious one was something that Paul was struggling with, but hadn't quite come, had landed on a definite maybe, of eating meat sacrificed to idols. Because frankly, what would happen is people would come and sacrifice a sheep or a goat or something like that to one of any number of gods at various temples. But what do you do with the meat? Well, you sell it and you buy it, and because the butchers would then take it and saying, "This is sacred meat," and then they take it home and serve it. And the question is that bad for Christians to participate in? And Paul was, if you know, yes, but if you don't, you're okay. Whereas whereas John of Patmos was much more on the don't trust it unless the sort of thing. So that's the less obvious one. Does that help, Cheryl?
Like, as in, don't trust the meat because it's not going to be healthy, or?
Well, no, as in this item was used in a ritual sacrifice, and if you eat it, you may be endangering yourself of violating that first commandment, because you're eating meat that has been, in essence, consecrated to another god.
Okay.
And that's where that And that was the one thing, like Paul was very much a don't ask, don't tell. I think John of Patmos was a little bit more, if you don't know where it comes from yourself, assume that it may have been sacrificed to an idol. Kind of thing. Now, granted, at this point, I am putting words in John of Patmos's because he's never that specific, but that's an example of two different ways of overt worship and inadvertent, but it was, you know,
Right.
it's so much a part of the culture. And you know, the thing is, I mean, Judaism up until the destruction of the temple engaged in ritual sacrifice of animals. And there were some instructions, depending upon what that was, is that the meat, sometimes, you know, the priest took it and ate it afterwards, or if it was a particular type where the intention was it's a complete sacrifice. It's actually where, unfortunately, it's where we get the word Holocaust from. But the idea is that the meat is completely consumed in fire. But these kinds of practices of sacrificing animals was common even amongst, and it was only after the destruction of the temple that the concept of animal sacrifices, especially in both Judaism and early Christianity, had basically said, we don't need to do that anymore. In Judaism, it fell out of practice for practical purposes, and from Christians' point of view, is that, well, Jesus covered that, so we don't have to do that anymore. So for them to kind of for early Christians especially, well, for Jews, there was also the kosher question too. But for early Christians, that eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols is redundant. There's no need to. Now, early Christians were not vegetarians, although I think in some places, it's funny, they were either accused of being effectively vegetarians or cannibals. And I'll just kind of hold that on, but that was an accusation leveled at early Christians. But that was from an outside perspective. I'll get to that in a second. Anyway, so the idea is that the personification, it isn't people that are being destroyed in the lake of fire. It's the personification of these vices that is destroyed. So if that makes sense, rather than, you know, that person, okay, you go in the lake of fire. It's more, it's in essence, it's those essences, I guess, for lack of a better term. So one of the things here is that description of the new heaven and new earth is probably, you know, at 32 verses, it is, you know, this is like in the visions of last things, you know, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that just happened very, very quickly. And then all of a sudden, in this description of the new heaven and new earth, which is number 7 in these visions of last things, instead of doing it 3 or 4 verses, it is like 32 verses in the way that we number it. I do have to be careful of that. All of the numbering conventions that we use, you know, within the Bible, you know, from start to finish, are constructs that are only about 1,000 years old at best. Okay. So, I mean, I've said this before, if you went up to, say, Eusebius, an early Christian, and said, you know, John 3:16, and he would look at you kind of going, what? But if you started to recite in Greek, for God so loved the world, he would be able to finish the sentence for you. Because those verse references only came in after time. That everybody sort of, to make sure that everybody was on the same page, that's where the whole chapter and verse thing was developed. So in this, the 32 verses encompassed in this is this longest single description of in Revelation. And so therefore, John, this was very important to John, and it's worth paying attention to. And things have been building up to this point. Even that here who the players are is the core message. in essence of who the players are, this is ultimately where we're moving to. And so this is very important for John. And so what he's doing here is he's drawing on a whole bunch of different traditions in evoking the New Jerusalem, especially Jewish apocalyptic literature. He leans quite a bit on Ezekiel. I mean, up until this point, he's been doing a lot with Exodus and the plagues of Egypt, that ultimately the plagues of Egypt led to the freeing of the people and their release from the bondage of slavery. You know, granted, there's this whole wilderness thing and that kind of thing, but ultimately the release from that release. So he used that as sort of the framework ahead of time, but now is relying on Jewish apocalyptic literature here, and especially Ezekiel. Remember last week I asked you to read Revelation 21 through 22, vision of the New Jerusalem, but compare it to Ezekiel chapter 40 through 43, roughly. And so, but you also have this description of the ideal city. And of course, by the time you get to about chapter 28 in Exodus, you're no longer talking about the story of Pharaoh and Moses and the release. You're in this kind of legal text and this design of the city's foundation matches the vestments that priests are to wear, curiously enough. But it also, if the city of Babylon has been a feature up until this point, and Babylon is no longer mentioned, by the way, in these chapters, you have a New Jerusalem in contrast with the Babylon, aka Rome. And so you have this new Jerusalem, and Rome is sometimes called the eternal city. Well, this is the New Jerusalem is the real eternal city. And so there are parallels to the description of Babylon, as Herodotus described it, roughly in 400. Would have been roughly 500 years before the writing of Revelation. But also, especially in Ezekiel, the description of the new temple. Now, just as a matter of here's a matter of historical fact. The temple as Ezekiel described it was never built. There was a new temple built, but it didn't follow Ezekiel's floor plan. Okay. And it that second temple was built, it was expanded upon. Herod the Great, as he was referred to, expanded the temple very much so, and that largely stood in place until the First Jewish-Roman War, and in roughly 66-ish, during the First Jewish-Roman War, Jerusalem was sacked and the temple was completely destroyed, and it's never been rebuilt. There is a wall, one wall left of it. It's referred to as the Wailing Wall. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, that is the Wailing Wall. That is the last remnants of it. And then on top of the Temple Mount, during, of course, the rise of Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built on top of it. And that's one of the reasons why that is so contentious, because you have two very these holy sites side by side, and in some respects, people like those in the real, for lack of a better term, real zealots on both sides see the others as trespassers. But here, this is separate from that, because at the time that John of Patmos did this, Islam was still 500 years away, and the temple had been destroyed at this point. It had been probably reduced to rubble for about 33 years. And so this description of the new temple is John of Patmos goes back and draws on these images from Ezekiel. But the thing is, it's not a temple, it's the whole city. And so instead of just the temple being a holy place, it's the whole city is a holy place. Now, here are the measurements. Measurements are kind of fun. And Brad, I hope you have your Star Trek ears on. So, in terms of overall size, is that it is a cube that is 1,500 miles. You know, in each, each axis of the cube is 1,500 miles in terms of size. Okay, so actually, Brad, this is bigger than a Borg cube. And by the way, it's flying. Did I mention that? You know, because you're dealing with something like John of Patmos does not use the term miles. He uses the term stadia, and one stadia is about 1/8 of a mile, roughly 200 meters. So if you do the math, you know, here I have this in miles, and so really what I should be doing is giving it to you in I should be giving it to you in let's see, on Stadia 200, so yeah, 2,400 kilometers on each axis. So you know, this is things the size of a big asteroid. So it, you know, rather large, but it's also foursquare. So foursquare, in other words, it's entirely symmetrical. So Brad, the New Jerusalem kind of looks a little bit like a Borg cube. And this is John's description of an ideal city in which all have been redeemed. Now keep in mind, like this isn't just kind of like a city that floats down and sits over there. This is, you know, it's in entirety, you know, as John is describing it. But some of this again is impossible to imagine. First off, it's flying. But in this city, everyone is redeemed, and I mean we're talking everyone, because and the other thing to remember is at the time of the writing of Revelation, as I mentioned before, Jerusalem is a smoking ruin. There, you know, like people may still live in and around it, but as far as a defensible city, it's gone. And there would be a couple more revolts, but by roughly 50, 60 years after the writing of Revelation, not only is Jerusalem like destroyed, anybody who's Jewish is exiled, and the city gets renamed, and it no longer retains the name Jerusalem for many years. Until I can't remember exactly what it was, but I mean, like under Emperor Hadrian, that's what happened. So the idea of the concept of this is a metaphor for human community. In other words, you know, God's you know, John's description of the ideal city is also the ultimate description of human community. And the idea is that it is so large, it can hold everybody. And if you think of it as a multi-level cube that's 24 you know, 2,400 kilometers in every direction, that is a cube with multiple levels all the way through it, that could still hold the entire population of Earth today. As a matter of fact, I think someone pointed out there'll be you wouldn't have much elbow room, but you could pack every human being on the planet into the civic space present in Los Angeles. So here, there'd be plenty of room for everybody. But the other thing is the gates are always open. And unfortunately, this is something in a modern age where we do not have walled cities that is completely foreign to us. Of course, the gates are always open. I mean, you know, like doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about gates opening and closing. But in this particular time, every city, in order to, as a matter of protection, built walls against raiders, bandits, marauders, other nations, for security purposes. And in this case, the gates are always open. In other words, things are so secure and so free that the doors are always open at all times, and people can come and go as they please. And so there are 12 entrances. And curiously enough, instead of going northeast, south, southwest, you actually have this kind of listing that is different. Like so, you know, it's paying attention to it. But the other thing is, and this is the most important part about the new city, is that those who once opposed God, namely the kings of earth, who are named in chapter 19, who ally with the evil ones, are welcome. And now, granted, there's also here an echo from Isaiah chapter 60, "Arise, shine, for your light has come," which also echoes the visit of the Magi around Epiphany. But the idea is that the kings of the earth are come and are welcomed. Everything is made new. In other words, if we have this exclusionary passage in chapter 21, verse 8, what we have is the complete redemption of the entire world, all of creation, all of humanity here. No one is excluded. Everyone is welcome. And so the idea is that, and so no longer is like God up there or away somewhere, but God's presence is right, is always present. The idea is, for John Patmos, this was actually a reality that was real at all times. You know, we're always in the presence of God, and his expression and description of the city is a way of affirming that. But that the world, this is ultimately where we're going, where all is redeemed, all evil is destroyed, all chaos brought back. Evil will be defeated, and any resistance that it provides is futile. Thank you very much, Brad. Another Star Trek reference there. Now, this is not about sort of speculative questions about our chronological future of the time but rather in the fullness. This is about the fullness of time. And so the idea is to understand that in a world, ultimately, we are moving to a point where all are redeemed, not people excluded, but all are present, all come, and God saves all. Which, you know, for some of us who may have been raised in a more exclusionary environment, that if you don't do this, or this, you're going to hell. Revelation's message is the opposite, is that all of us are ultimately moving towards God's redemption. The trouble is that we kind of get hung up in the lake of fire bit. And the idea is the lake of fire is more along the lines of something in which the darker natures of ourselves are melted away. And in, you know, we are moving towards a fullness of life in God. And so the idea is, John's message here is, don't give in, live with hope. No matter what you are currently experiencing, ultimately we are moving into and constantly moving towards this ultimate redemption in God. And then, so that's the New Jerusalem. Any questions before we get into the last part? So David, and you are muted, just so you're aware.
I am more. I was wondering about comparing that with Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Not sure, it doesn't seem to jibe.
Well, it doesn't jive 100%. 100%. I mean, it echoes like, you know, it's one of these things. When my dad taught English, he would do something called a comparison. He would have his students do a comparison contrast essay. If I was giving assignments, that's one thing that I would do, is I would say, well, where is it similar and where is it different? And like Ezekiel imagined an enormous temple, you know, not a vast, you know, but it was still a temple. There were still, you know, these concentric walls in a central place in which how many of you are familiar with the term Holy of Holies?
Mhm.
Okay. In the temple in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies was the place where, like, let me just back up for a second. Do you know the difference between a temple, a church, a tabernacle? Like each of these, even though we use these names interchangeably, they all actually mean different things. A church in English is the English rendition of the word ecclesia, which actually means gathered assembly. And church is a uniquely Christian word that has been co-opted by a number of different groups, like the Church of Scientology. Church is a Christian, like it would be like calling it the synagogue of Scientology. Synagogue is specifically a teaching place, but it's associated with Jewish tradition. A mosque is a worship place associated specifically with Islam. But on the other hand, something a little bit more generic, a temple, on the other hand, a temple is a place in which it's not a place that you go to worship a given deity. That's where the deity lives, and that the deity's presence is there. And so you are going to worship, but you're actually going to be present with the deity there. So the temple of Zeus is called the Temple of Zeus because they believe that you know, you walk in there and you are in the presence of Zeus. And so the temple in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, is where God was actually thought to be most present. And the divine name, apparently once a year they would go in, and the high priest would go in and utter God's actual name inside the Holy of Holies once a year. And it was thought, you know, like the whole thing, people make jokes about showing up in church and getting struck by lightning. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Richard. It was, you know, it was genuinely thought that if you entered a temple and were particularly in the temple in Jerusalem and were in a state of ritual uncleanness, that you might actually get burned up. And so the temple's been destroyed. And so when the temple was destroyed earlier, you know, when in the exile, the idea of restoring that temple, Ezekiel was still very much a restore the temple, that Holy of Holies. Whereas in Revelation, the Holy of Holies isn't just a location inside the temple, it is the whole city. God's presence is in the whole thing. And that's one of the big differences between, you know, like it's got these concentric walls and things like that, and it's very large, very square, these large, but still very flat on the ground kind of thing. Whereas, John of Patmos like basically puts it on its end and turns it into a cube. So I don't know if that helps or not, but the concept of the temple.
Okay. Also, Ezekiel's from the Old Testament, so well before Jesus.
Oh yes.
And so I thought that might have had a bearing on the differences as well.
Well, Possibly, but also, you know, John of Patmos is also drawing on a whole bunch of different things. But you know, keep in mind that with there are 1.5 Old Testament references in every like on balance, on average. There's roughly 1.5 references to the Old Testament in every single verse of Revelation. And that's just to the Old Testament. Never mind what we've also noted, that there's references to Greco-Roman culture and even Babylonian mythology and everything else, sort of all just kind of like smashed together. The term that was used a couple of years ago is a mashup. So what you have is he's pulling images from Ezekiel, but he's not leaving it just intact. He's then mixing it up with something else and doing and continuing to do that. So and the images come fast and furious.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Mhm.
I kind of wonder where he gets that kind of a change, though.
Well,
Seems
most
quite a big change.
yeah, and I think in part is that he's envisioning it like writ large of he's not just simply copying Ezekiel at this point in time. He's using it for inspiration and then like expanding it well beyond. You know, he's letting his imagination fly. And like really fly. One of the things that I've said about Revelation is basically a late 1st century equivalent of science fiction.
Yeah.
And for me, that's not putting it down at all. That is the highest compliment I can pay it. Because if you know me, I am a total nerd.
You mentioned the fact that this cube is flying as well, right?
Yes.
And
It descends.
but also it had gates.
Yes.
Yeah, and if it's flying, then it almost to me seems like they expect there are other flying objects, perhaps.
Well, the whole
Gate to go in and a gate to go out.
yeah. Well, I think the idea is that it descends down to heaven, and maybe it's just kind of like keep in mind, pictorial, not necessarily logical. That somehow, even though it's flying, like gravity isn't a thing, and that sort of thing, is that you just have this whole this whole the doors are open. We never actually see the city land per se, but it comes down out of heaven, and so there is this floating element to it.
Was the other thing it talks about? There's no light. There's no sunlight. There's no darkness.
There's no need for it. Yes,
because the illumination is provided by the presence of God.
Yeah, and again, like what you have here is like don't try and think of it like in these kind of terms, is that like it's highly metaphorical. And so all of these images are playing with each other.
I'm not. It's actually encouraging me to play with my imagination. So I was thinking of like one of the science fiction books that I had a few decades ago was James Blish's Cities in Flight.
Mm-hmm.
And the image came to me about that book.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So yeah, no, I get it. It's not literal. It's
yeah. And the concept of flying cities, like Well, I mean, to a certain extent, you know, like if you ever saw the movie Avatar, like the
Yeah.
new one is out. If you're,
Yeah.
you know, there's
Yeah.
places where, you know, it is rife with this mineral with gravity defying rock, and you have places that look like the interior of China, except they float.
And there are other science fiction books well before that
Oh
describe
yeah,
those things also.
oh yeah, and working with that, and you know, perhaps some of they draw their inspiration from the concept of the New Jerusalem. Um,
So I
so
think that John of Patmos might have made a good science fiction writer too.
the keep in mind, this is the first century equivalent of science fiction. I'm not saying he could have been, he was, but just not necessarily recognizes that. And now keep in mind, people often get hung up on the concept of fiction. This is still talking about very much you know, a reality that people face, but used it in metaphorical ways. I mean, in the same way that that Tolkien's works, and especially C.S. Lewis's works, for example, all had, you know, well, C.S. Lewis was, they were much more allegory, whereas Tolkien, it was more metaphors. You know, because with C.S. Lewis, you could draw a one-to-one correlation between Aslan and Jesus, for example. Whereas in Tolkien, it was more like there was more the concept of good and evil, and the personal struggle with that, and the ring being that burden that one seeks to free themselves from. Just, you know, again, these are entirely fictional books, but they do, as with any good fiction, it is pointing to some degree of truth. Anyway, so getting back to that, like David did, I do like we can come back and talk to this a little bit more. I want to sort of bring this to a close, and then we can kind of seesaw back through anything that we've covered in this course, start to finish. So one of the things that John is quite quite adamant is that where are we here? I think it's do not where are we here? Said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Let evildoers still eat. Okay. You know, the idea is that do not seal up this book. In other words, you know, the time is near. Kairos is present. You know, there still will be things that we find that we're still struggling against, and that's the idea is that in the mid, like what we have here is now that we're transitioning out of the vision now at this point, we actually the like 22 verse 7 is where the vision in essence comes to an end, but he still continues to use symbolic language in it, even though we've kind of transitioned out of that. And the idea is that, do remember also, Revelation was intended to be read start to finish in a service of worship, start to finish. And that means that if you were to sit down and listen to it, probably in English, I think I did a word count on it. It would take roughly an hour and a half read out loud. Give or take, maybe a little bit longer. And usually it was probably done ahead of communion. So in essence, sometimes we've had special worship services where it's kind of like something is themed. Well, this you know, Revelation in many respects was a themed worship service, and so the idea is that you know, of course, and it finishes with the grace of our Lord Jesus be with you all, and may have actually that amen may actually have been an addition. So I just want to kind of a couple of things here. There are a couple of passages in here we need to actually be careful of, and I sort of alluded to this in an earlier session. It says here in 22 verse 18, I warn everyone who hears the word of the prophecy of this book, and if anyone adds to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book. If anyone takes away the words of this prophecy, God will take away that person's share in the tree of life in the holy city, which is described in this book. In other words, don't change the words, is what he's saying. But here's the thing. More often than not, that passage has been used to effectively so-called close the canon, that this applies to the entire Bible just because of where it lands. These are the last few verses, and what John was referring to wasn't the whole Bible, because John didn't know that the book itself would be canonized, and it wouldn't be really readily accepted, for at least another 200 years, kind of across the board. So it was never intended to apply to anything other than Revelation itself. And the reason is because the poetic language that he uses and the careful turns of phrases that he uses, he wanted, it's like, essentially it's respect my artistic integrity, keep this as it's transmitted, and try and keep it that way. Where are we here? But it's also, in this time, like he also points out, here's the vision of things that, but then he kind of draws back and says, but we're not, like, here's who the players are. This is ultimately where we're heading. But we're still in this in between, the time is near, he says, but he's not talking chronological. God's presence and God's kairos time is near. In other words, it's present and with us. And so therefore, the evil that you see going on, ultimately it will defeat itself, is what he's trying to say there. And then, of course, he brings it to a close. And that comes to the end of the content as far as this is concerned. A couple of small caveats. I have a couple more slides, but this slide has no other comments on it other than the title. So if you have any questions at all at any point for anything for the entire thing, let me know. And Betty, I've actually got something again related to the point you brought up, I think very early in the course. There's a couple pictures here you might find both interesting, and I hope you find them offensive. Okay, because I certainly do. There's a tease. So any questions or thoughts or things that you wanted to cover?
Just wondering, in John's other books, does he, because I haven't read them, does he say the same thing about do not make any changes in this book?
Well, I could only answer that if we actually had any of John's other books. This is John of Patmos. He is not responsible for the writing of the Gospel of John or the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John. So the answer to that question is I don't know.
Okay.
So like keep in mind, like the trouble is we tend to kind of say, oh, John, and like, how many people do you know by the name of John?
John.
Like that, it is one of the world's most common names. I mean, as I said earlier, I'm not sure if for those of you who weren't here, is that Muhammad is an Arabic variation on the origins of John. So you kind of got it like its pronunciation in Hebrew is Yohanan, and you can see how that linguistically could be Muhammad.
Yeah.
Just
I had thought that John of Patmos was responsible for those other
nope,
books. So
nope.
that's where I
Because well, here's a couple of things. John of Patmos was thoroughly schooled in Greek. You know, he knew Greek, he spoke Greek well, he knew all of the Greek imagery, and wrote this in what is now Asia Minor, but part of the Greco-Roman Empire, in a thoroughly Greek speaking area. On the other hand, the writers of the Gospel of John and the letters of John were, came from what is most likely to have been an example of what became what is now a lost community of Jewish Christians. And they were likely centered out of Alexandria, on the other side of the Mediterranean from where they were. Yeah, did they speak Greek? Of course they did. Everybody spoke Greek. But if you can kind of think of it, John of Patmos was like would have spoke Greek with a Greek accent, whereas John of the Gospel of John would have spoken Greek with an Egyptian accent. But the trouble is that we tend to kind of, oh, well, John, and we just kind of lump them all together. But even the early Christians began to recognize that the writer of the Gospel of John and John of Patmos were two different people. There's one thing like among the saints, like you might hear the phrase Saint John the Divine. There's an Anglican church in Victoria called Saint John the Divine Anglican Church. I'm assuming it's still there. I worship. I was part of an ecumenical service there when I was doing my internship in Victoria, and so you actually have an example of a church specifically named after John of Patmos, because Saint John the Divine is that one, whereas Saint John in terms of the gospel writer, different people. At least I'm hoping I'm getting my saints right there, Richard. Yeah, like you would know, but at the same time, there are a lot of and curiously enough, the very first church that I ever served at was called St. John's, served at after I was ordained. People made a lot of jokes about that. So I mean that's one thing to keep in mind. So in other words, that presence, that wanting to keep things like intact, no, that's not present in the Gospel of John at all. It's worth a study of its own. Marilyn, you have a question.
Remind me again when this was written compared to the rest of the Bible.
Okay. Even though it's the last book of the Bible here, it's certainly not the oldest, or sorry, it's certainly not the youngest. It was written roughly in the last decade of the first century, so roughly 90 to 95. Sometime during the reign of Emperor Domitian, but before Emperor Domitian died. Domitian died in 96. Because if he died, if Emperor Domitian died, that would have been present in the book, and it's not. So they actually have to say, okay. And they also know that Revelation was being quoted in other scripture that can be dated to about roughly to 100, or not so much other scripture, but early church writings. So they, oddly enough, it's one of the few books of the New Testament that we can actually narrow it down to a 5-year period of when it came together, or when it entered into circulation. I mean, it may have been started to have been composed prior to that, but in terms of it entered into things somewhere in that 90 to 95 period. So on the other hand, some of the latter letters of the where are we here? Like the letters of Peter, James, other things, other ones like that, are early 2nd century. So they would be, but the trouble is the dating range on them is pretty wide open. Sometimes they can figure, well, it happened sometimes in this 50-year gap. We're not entirely sure.
Was
Whereas
it
go ahead.
before Paul's?
Revelation? No, Paul is the earliest. For example, First Thessalonians is the oldest piece of Christian writing that we have. And it dates to roughly 54. Although I've got a friend and colleague who actually dates his writings a little earlier than that, but somewhere in the just towards the latter half of, most stuff entered into writing right around the halfway mark of the 1st century. Because if you think of it this way, Jesus' ministry was roughly in the 30 to 36 range.
Yeah.
And the first writings would come roughly about 20 years later, because at that point in time, when Jesus, the people who followed Jesus were largely illiterate, but as they gained followers, you started to gain followers who were literate, and the most prominent and the earliest of those was Paul, and hence why you have this corpus of writing, because he wrote letters, largely in a culture that was dominantly not literate, and so that's that transition point of moving from an oral culture to a written culture. So that's where that kind of happens. Whereas the Gospels themselves drew on oral traditions that date quite a ways back, but they didn't actually, ink did not hit paper until right around the time of the destruction of the temple, right around 66 or so for the Gospel of Mark, which is the oldest one, and then you have both Luke and Matthew being later than that, probably somewhere between somewhere around 80 to 100, around that time.
And I'm sure you did talk about that before.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of coming together in my head. So Jesus dies.
Yep.
Then Paul gets blinded, and then he starts forming churches,
Mhm.
and then he starts writing to those churches.
Yes.
And it's not until after that that the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John come out.
Yes. Even though some of those stories were very much in circulation,
But they weren't written down.
but they hadn't emerged into the forms that we now know.
Yeah.
So I mean that's like there, it's all this kind of nebulous. Keep in mind these books didn't just simply like all fall out of the sky on Easter Sunday of 33
No.
AD. And that's what many of us forget, is they didn't just kind of and land. They all evolved. And Revelation is right actually in the middle of that period, because as I said before, in the writings of Paul actually at that point in time, even though the Romans executed Jesus, he was still quite favorable to them. Particularly, now that having been said, he also wasn't entirely sure who was reading his mail, with letters going back and forth. So in Romans, when he's writing to the church in Rome, which curiously enough he did not found, tradition says it was Peter, but again, we're not entirely sure about that, because when Paul is talking about Peter, he's talking about meeting Peter in Jerusalem, not in Rome. Something to keep in mind. maybe that would make me a rank heretic if I were Roman Catholic, but I'm not sure. I'm seeing Richard smile again. But it's one of these things where there are certain things that we take on a tradition that may not be historically accurate.
So when did John of Patmos die? Do we know that?
No, we have no idea. All we have is this particular writing. We don't know. John of Patmos has been depicted as this decrepit old man because, of course, people were assuming that John of Patmos was also the writer of the Gospel of John. Fairly early, a tradition developed at that point. But what eventually sort of came. So, I mean, he probably, he was old enough to be very well educated in a whole bunch of different fields. He was a polymath. Sort of a late first century equivalent of you've heard the phrase a Renaissance man.
Yeah, there's a song.
Da Vinci, Galileo were specialists in their own field, but they had mastered a whole lot of things. Partly because the knowledge, the human knowledge base at that point in time was still reasonably small, so it was actually possible to almost learn everything. And numerology, mathematics, all Greek literature, and then knowing Babylonian mythology, knowing the Old Testament, knowing Greco-Roman mythology, all of this, and just like getting it all in this book in this poetic form is just, it's an amazing literary feat.
So do you think that's why the angel was sent specifically to him?
Probably, like that I can't speculate because I cannot know the mind of God.
No, of course not.
But I would say that in order to be, and also keep in mind, it was also a literary style of the day where he's like he's using this language to describe effectively the ineffable. And that can be quite things, but he's also very specific, as this is a caution against the like the main thrust and focus of Revelation is this caution against having the church or faith in general becoming subservient to the state. Or to empire. He may not have used the phrase state. I mean, that's a more modern language, but I mean, effectively that's what it was, is subservient to empire. And the trouble is, we see dangers of that all the time. As I said, I've got one of the big thrusts, of course, is these, what happens when religion submits to politics, people die. And quite often, especially unfortunately, when like since 9/11, there's been a real, like religion is the cause of all violence in the world. It's like, no, politics is, but religion gives it a veneer of legitimacy that people then will commit any sort of atrocity in the name of religion, not realizing that the religion has become subservient to a political agenda. So here are some images that I find personally extraordinarily offensive, and they're current examples of this. Now, actually, I won't say current. These images are probably about a little over 10 to 15 years old. Okay, but how about this one? Or that one? Or that one? Or that one?
Yeah, there's a lot of stars and stripes.
Yes. That somehow Jesus is exclusively American. I'll get those off. the
I've
screen.
never seen those before.
Oh yeah, and they float around. And the thing is like Christian nationalism, for example, in particularly in the United States, but it's also present in Canada, is an example of where religion is becoming subservient to the like, even if it's not necessarily to people in power, but to a political idea. And so it's not just simply to the existing powers that be in a state, but also subservient to a political concept and idea, as opposed to letting God be God. And so that's one thing that we have to be careful. I mean, regardless of what our political stripe happens to be, it's the moment in which we find religion being used to justify our political beliefs, or rather when we kind of back myself into a little bit of a corner here, but whenever we find that religion has come to the point where our politics determine what we believe, as opposed to allowing our faith guide us in terms of how we are to treat one another. It becomes dangerous. I mean, Revelation is a very inclusive. It's a very inclusive book, but if you stop at certain points, it can be quite exclusionary. But in the end, all are brought together. All are redeemed. Nobody is left outside, and so there is no those people. And so to label somebody else as, oh, that's just a bunch of conservatives, or that's a bunch of liberals, is totally against what John of Patmos is after. All are redeemed in Christ. So we're just at the hour and 25 minute mark, and this is officially last slide. But any other questions, comments, snide remarks?
It's not the dreaded doom.
No, it is not the dreaded Book of Doom, as people make it out to be. It is not it is not fodder for horror movies. Okay, some of the images can be, but the trouble is if you there was a very famous. Well, he wasn't very famous. He's little known, and yet the most influential horror writer of the 20th century was a guy by the name of Howard Phillips Lovecraft. I'm, he was also, terribly racist, but a brilliant writer, and wrote the concept. He also happened to be atheist. I believe he was atheist, but he actually, I don't even think he knew. But he developed a type of horror fiction called cosmic horror. And famously, he wrote one thing is that, fear is a base human instinct, and the most raw fear is the fear of the unknown. And quite often, because we don't know Revelation, we have fear it. And what I'm hoping that, at least having gone through these 7 weeks, is on the other end of it, that it's no longer something to fear. Of shining light on it, and all of us come out the other side retaining our sanity.
It's someplace it said that, that the New Jerusalem was coming, and it came, and it was good for 1,000 years, but then that we had to be careful because Satan would again appear. So I'm thinking, all right, the way things are going these days, it seems, I have a hard time thinking that because they can bomb everybody in Ukraine and leave these people,
Mhm.
with, that's okay, and he gets the same as anybody else, yes.
Yeah, and you know, like do I have trouble with that? Yeah, but keep in mind, Revelation is metaphorical, not literal, and at any point, and it's this expression of ultimate hope that all of creation is redeemed, despite what is despite Hitler, despite Putin, despite Vlad the Impaler. Let's go back a couple centuries. Even if you how many of you know who Vlad the Impaler was? Okay, because a partial inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. There are examples of horrible human beings and horrible actions that human beings have perpetuated against one another. The largest is still within is just coming out of our living memory in terms of the Holocaust. And these things happen, and what this is that, keep in mind, Revelation is not about the ultimate hope that we're moving to, but that ultimate hope is actually present all around us at any given moment, and we could realize it at any given moment if we just simply open our eyes. That's the concept of the Kairos time, as opposed to chronological time that, oh, let's do time travel and let's travel 3,000 years in the future, and the New Jerusalem should already be there and well established, and then we'll be good. That's not what again, that's taking it literally, not metaphorically. And the idea is that the potential of what the New Jerusalem represents is potential at any moment that we can realize it. Even at the point at which we live, I don't know how many of you saw there was an article that apparently Nanaimo is the least religious community in Canada. Okay,
Yeah, saw that.
you've all seen that, and so, but the thing is, things come and go, go in cycles, and one of the reasons for that decline, curiously enough, is that religion becoming subservient to politics has turned a lot of people off. And the whole idea is of trying to understand our faith in terms of what are we doing to better and to realize the kingdom of God, in our midst, that is realized not by imposition but by presence. I realize I'm kind of going into this is a conversation more to have with my colleagues, but to be able to say the idea being that we are that what we are that the God's presence among us is something that we can have that book of life at any point. It's not a point in time that we're waiting for, but we can be a part of it at any time. I mean, that's actually, one of the reasons why I decided to continue Revelation right into Advent, as much as, like we've got, Christmas coming up in 12 days. No, today is not the first day of Christmas. That's December. Anyway, don't let me rant on that. But Advent is the season of Advent is about the expected coming of God, not just the child in the manger, but the coming of God in our midst, and the presence of God in our midst at any given time. So, and Brad just typed the question, what are the 12 days of Christmas? The first day, your partridge in a pear tree, Christmas Day, and then you start counting up from there. So on the Christmas Day service, I don't know, I need to talk to Sue. I don't know if I can get a partridge in a pear tree for that day. But the trouble is, if we start singing the 12 days of Christmas,
big tree,
it would be awfully short, because of course, on Christmas Day, on the First day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a partridge in a pear tree. Then you're done.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all you could fit in the tree,
Pretty much. The I saw that, Brad. By the way, through this whole thing, Brad's been messaging me, so
Oh, yeah.
he's been relaying his questions and stuff to me just through the chat function.
He's stumping you then.
No,
Oh.
I think I've answered most of them, because he did actually ask what are the 12 days of Christmas. I can answer that one. So, and the other ones are just sort of snide remarks, because I mentioned something. Does anybody have any snide remarks?
That's very surprising.
Which I appreciate. So I'm hoping you had I'm hoping you had fun.
Well, I'm glad you described again what Kairos is.
Yeah, and even then, admittedly, it takes me a lot of theological brain power to sort of get my head around what Kairos is. I mean, even the concept of eternity, we tend to think eternity as a just simply really long time, like, and eternity does not mean a really long chronological time. It is the essence of the fullness of time. And that from a science and so so in Greek, they have three different words for time. One and only one is the chronological time that we are most familiar with, and the seasonal time we are familiar with, but we don't think of it that way. And then the fullness of time being the right, in some respects, the fullness of time has been described as the right moment.
Yeah.
And sometimes the right moment happens and it's right there, and then we do that. So but sometimes the right moment comes and we miss it, or the right moment comes and we only realize after the fact that that was it. And so that becomes all part of that. So
do you think that he was actually describing heaven, and then how the phrase heaven on earth? So in my mind, those two things meet up with this idea of coming.
Yeah.
And just hope that everyone will.
Like it again, it becomes an very much an expression of hope, like here. I mean particularly keep in mind everything in Revelation is metaphorical, but he is describing heaven coming, like new heaven and new earth, and effectively the New Jerusalem is the embodiment of both.
Yeah.
And wiping every tear, like those kinds of things, which curiously enough are callbacks to Isaiah as well. So there's it's one of these things where you could just sit down for years just pulling back the references and then saying, well, not only just getting what the references are, but why was it that John of Patmos was using that particular phrase at that particular time? What is the context we're missing from this? And in that sense, I'm hoping that for as lurid and as disturbing as some of the imagery in Revelation can be, that it becomes a much more enjoyable thing to follow. And not only that, as I said before, Revelation is one of these things where we don't really like to read it, but we sure like to sing it. And oddly enough, some of the Christmas carols that we're going to be singing, particularly one that's actually not a Christmas carol, but we always call it a Christmas carol, Joy to the World. is an example of, it draws some of its inspiration from Revelation. Love divinal, loves excelling, and you know, angels from the realms of glory. There's all kinds of things that we can work with that. Curiously enough, I'm not sure, David. Actually, here's a little bit of housekeeping. I'm actually gonna bring it to a close in terms of I'm going to stop the recording. But David, there's a little bit of and